worked at Meridian Health Systems for 22 years, and for most of that time, I was the guy nobody noticed until something broke. That's not a complaint. That's just how it works when you're the one keeping the lights on. My name is Walter Briggs. I started at Meridian in 2002, fresh off a decade at a regional insurance company where I'd learned more about legacy database architecture than most people learn in a lifetime. Meridian brought me in to fix a billing system that was hemorrhaging claim rejections. Medicare, Medicaid, private insurers, all of it. The system was a patchwork disaster that some vendor had sold them in 1998 and then quietly abandoned. Nobody could make heads or tails of it. They'd had 3 consultants look at it before me. All 3 walked away. I stayed. Within 6 months, I had the rejection rate down from 31% to under 4%. Within a year, I'd rebuilt the core claims routing engine from scratch. Documented every decision, every workaround, every regulatory flag that had to be hard-coded because the insurers changed their own rules without telling anybody. By 2005, Meridian's billing operation was cleaner than hospitals 3 times our size. The CFO at the time, a quiet man named Ed, who wore the same brown cardigan every Friday, shook my hand in the hallway one afternoon and said, "Walter, I sleep at night because of you." I kept that with me for a long time. Meridian grew over the years. We went from a single hospital in Dayton, Ohio, to a network of 11 facilities across 3 states. Every acquisition brought a new billing nightmare, different systems, different coding conventions, different payer contracts. Every time they handed it to me. I integrated all of it. I built a clearinghouse interface that let all 11 facilities talk to each other. I designed the audit logging system that tracked every single claim transaction, every denial, every appeal, every payment down to the timestamp. I did it because if something ever went sideways with a payer or a regulator, we needed a paper trail that could survive a federal audit. That last part matters, remember it. I also built what I privately called the compliance watchdog. It was an automated monitoring layer that sat underneath the main billing platform. It didn't do anything dramatic. It just watched. If transaction data was ever altered outside of standard workflow, if someone tried to backdate a claim, recode a denial, or push through a payment that didn't match the original authorization, the watchdog flagged it and created an immutable log entry. I'd built it after a smaller hospital we'd acquired turned out to have a billing fraud problem that their previous vendor had quietly helped them bury. We caught it during integration. I wasn't going to let that happen to us. I told the CFO about the watchdog when I built it. I documented it in the system architecture files. Nobody else ever asked about it, so nobody else really knew the details of how it worked. That wasn't intentional secrecy. That was just the reality of being the only person in the organization who understood the infrastructure at that level. For 22 years, I was Walter from IT. The guy with the coffee thermos who got in at 7 and left at 6. The guy you called when the claims weren't moving. The guy who knew where everybody was buried in the code base because he'd buried most of them himself with full documentation and a note explaining why. Then, in the spring of 2024, everything changed. Ed, the CFO, had retired 2 years earlier. His replacement was a sharp woman who understood finance but not operations, and she'd been gradually pushing to modernize, which in corporate language means replacing everything that works with something newer that probably won't, at least not right away. I understood the impulse. I'd had the same conversation with her predecessor. You manage it, you phase things in carefully, you don't blow up a system that's processing $40 million in claims per month because some vendor promised you efficiency gains. Then the new CEO arrived. His name was Corey Stanton, 41 years old, MBA from Duke, background in private equity healthcare roll-ups. He'd spent the last 8 years acquiring distressed hospital systems, cutting costs, and selling them before the cuts caught up with him. He arrived in Dayton in January 2024 with a lot of energy and a very clear agenda. Meridian was going to become a technology-forward, AI-integrated health system within 18 months. I heard that phrase in his first all-staff address and wrote in my notepad, "Define technology forward." I never got a good answer. Corey brought in his own team, a chief digital officer named Amber who was 34 and had never worked in healthcare billing, and a VP of technology named Derek, who had an impressive resume and almost no practical infrastructure experience. Both of them were excellent at presentations. Both of them had opinions about everything and knowledge of very little. In March, Amber pulled me into a meeting and told me they were going to replace the core billing platform with a cloud-based solution from a vendor called ClearPath Systems. ClearPath was relatively new. Their product was designed for smaller, single-facility practices. They'd never done an integration at the scale of an 11-facility network. I explained this, calmly, with documentation. Amber told me that ClearPath had assured them the integration would be straightforward. I asked if I could speak with ClearPath's technical team directly before we signed anything. She said that wasn't necessary. That was the first bad sign. Over the next 2 months, I submitted 3 separate technical memos outlining my concerns. The payer interface configurations alone would take 18 months to migrate safely. Our audit logging infrastructure had compliance requirements tied to our Medicare certification. You couldn't just swap it out without a gap-free transition plan. The watchdog system needed to be rebuilt from the ground up in any new environment, and rebuilding it correctly would require someone who understood why it existed in the first place. Nobody responded to the memos. Not in writing. In May, Derek stopped by my office, which I still think of as a genuine gesture on his part even now, and told me quietly that Corey had decided to move forward regardless. He said, "Walter, I want you to know I raised some of your concerns internally. I was told to drop it. I appreciated that. I told him I'd do everything I could to make the transition work. What I didn't tell him was that I was already doing the math on my pension, which vested fully at the end of September." On June 12th, Corey called me into his office. He had Amber with him and someone from HR. The HR person was holding a folder. I knew what folders meant. Corey told me that as part of Meridian's transformation journey, they were restructuring the IT organization. My role was being eliminated. He said they were bringing in a managed services team to handle infrastructure, and that my historical expertise, while appreciated, didn't align with where the organization was heading. Then he said something I'll never forget as long as I live. He said I was a product of a different era. I sat with that for a moment. 22 years, $40 million a month in claims, 0 major compliance failures, 0 successful fraud incidents, an audit log system that had already survived 2 federal reviews and 1 state investigation, a product of a different era. I asked very calmly whether they'd considered the transition risks given that the ClearPath migration was still 4 months from completion. Corey said ClearPath's team would handle it. I was given 60 days of severance and asked to clear up my office by Friday. I spent those last 3 days doing something I thought was actually responsible. I put together the most thorough transition document I'd ever written in my career. Every system, every password, every undocumented configuration, every payer-specific quirk, every compliance flag. I documented the watchdog system too, how it worked, what it watched for, how to maintain it. I handed it all to Derek on my last day. He shook my hand and looked like he wanted to say something but didn't. I drove home on Friday afternoon, made myself a grilled cheese sandwich, and started thinking about what to do with my Tuesdays. My wife, Ellen, said I seemed lighter. She was probably right. 22 years of being the guy responsible for everything takes a weight you don't always notice until it's gone. I spent the summer doing things I'd put off for years. I finished the deck I'd been building in the backyard. I drove my youngest son up to Michigan to look at graduate programs. I read 4 books in July, which might be a personal record. I kept my phone on because Derek texted occasionally with questions, and I answered them. I figured I owed him that much. He was a decent guy stuck in a bad situation. In August, the questions from Derek got more frequent. In September, they stopped. I found out later that Derek had been let go in late August, part of another round of restructuring. The managed services team Corey had brought in was now fully in charge. ClearPath was live on 3 of the 11 facilities, with the others in various states of migration. I found all of this out because my old colleague Patrice, who worked in the billing department and was one of the few people who really understood the payer interface on a day-to-day operational level, started texting me in October. The first text said, "Walter, something is wrong with the Medicare claims. They're not moving." I texted back, "Who did you tell?" She said she told the managed services team. They said it was a ClearPath configuration issue and they were working on it. I told her to keep me posted and to document everything. 4 days later, she texted again, "Walter, it's not just Medicare. None of the claims are routing. We have 8 facilities completely frozen. Corey is in an emergency meeting with ClearPath right now." I put my phone down and went back to the book I was reading. I want to be honest here, because I've thought about this a lot. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to grief. The particular kind that comes from watching something you built and loved get broken by people who never understood what they had. I knew those systems. I knew every one of those facilities. I knew that somewhere in Dayton and Columbus and Louisville, billing coordinators were staring at frozen screens, and that real patients were going to feel this eventually. That's not a good feeling, even when you had nothing to do with it. Ellen found me sitting on the back deck that evening, just staring at the yard. "The hospital?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. She didn't say anything else. She brought me a cup of coffee and sat with me for a while. The next morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. I'm glad I did. It was a woman who introduced herself as the chair of Meridian's board of directors. Her name was Louise. She had a voice that sounded like she'd been in boardrooms for 40 years, which she probably had. She said, "Mr. Mystery, Briggs, I apologize for calling you directly. I understand you left Meridian under circumstances that were not ideal. I'm calling because we have a serious situation." I said, "I know." She paused. "How do you know?" "Patrice texts me," I said. Another pause. "I see. Mr. Briggs, we're currently unable to process claims across 8 of our 11 facilities. We have approximately $72 million in receivables frozen. Our Medicare certification could be at risk if this extends past 30 days. ClearPath cannot diagnose the core issue. Their team believes it's related to something in the underlying infrastructure that predates their system." I knew exactly what it was. The watchdog. The compliance monitoring layer I'd built in 2019. It had flagged something. I didn't know what yet, and because nobody had rebuilt it correctly in the ClearPath environment, it had gone into a safe state lockdown. It wasn't malicious. It was doing exactly what I designed it to do. It was protecting the data, but it also meant nobody could touch the claims until someone who understood its logic could either resolve the underlying flag or authorize a safe override. I said, "Louise, I need to ask you something before we go any further." She said, "Of course." "What happened to Corey Stanton?" A pause that told me everything. "Mr. Stanton is currently on administrative leave pending a board review." I didn't push it. I found out later from Patrice that the watchdog had flagged a pattern of claim recodings on 3 facilities, the kind of thing that could look to a federal auditor like systematic upcoding for reimbursement purposes. Whether it was intentional or a ClearPath configuration error, I genuinely still don't know. But my audit log system had flagged it, locked the affected records, and because the lockdown was designed to survive a system migration, it had cascaded correctly into the ClearPath environment through the integration layer I'd built. My code had outlasted the people who replaced me. Louise asked if I would be willing to come in and help diagnose the situation. I said yes, but I told her I had conditions. She said, "Go ahead." I said I wanted a consulting agreement, not employment, consulting, at a day rate that I named, which was more than my old annual salary divided by 220. I said I wanted full access to all system environments, no intermediaries. I said I wanted written confirmation that any findings related to the flagged claims would be handled through proper compliance channels, not buried. She agreed to all of it within the hour. The consulting agreement was in my email before noon. I drove to the Dayton facility the next morning. I wore my old Meridian fleece, the one from the 2008 systems upgrade project that Ellen had washed so many times it had almost no color left. And I carried my thermos. Some things don't change. The managed services team looked at me like I was an artifact from another time. I found the root issue within 4 hours. The watchdog had flagged a batch of claims on 3 facilities that had been recoded during the ClearPath migration. The vendor's automated translation layer had misread some of our payer-specific modifiers and rewritten them in a way that would have triggered a Medicare audit. It wasn't fraud. It was a translation error. But the watchdog didn't know the difference, which was exactly the point. It flagged it, locked it, and waited for a human decision. I documented the finding, wrote the override authorization with a full explanation, and submitted it to the compliance office with a recommendation for an external audit of the affected claims. Not because we had to, but because it was the right thing to do. The clearance went through. Claims started moving within 6 hours of my arrival. I spent 2 more weeks on site, fixing what could be fixed and documenting what couldn't. I trained 3 people on the watchdog system. I wrote a 60-page technical supplement to the transition document I'd left with Derek, updated for the ClearPath environment. I charged my day rate for every one of those days. Louise bought me lunch on my last day. She was in her late 60s, calm, direct, the kind of person who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. She said, "I want to ask you something honestly. Did you design that system knowing this could happen someday?" I thought about it for a moment. I designed it knowing that something could always go wrong, I said. I just didn't know when, or what it would be, or who would be in charge when it happened. She nodded. Corey is not coming back, she said. I want you to know that. I told her I didn't have any personal feelings about Corey one way or the other. That was mostly true. What I'd like, I said, is for someone to look at the long-term transition plan and make sure the next 18 months don't repeat the last 18 months. She said she'd have her team call me. They called. I'm 3 months into a part-time consulting arrangement with Meridian now. I work about 20 hours a week. I set my own schedule. I still have Tuesdays free. I finished the deck. Ellen and I are planning a trip to Portugal in March that we've been talking about for 6 years. The thing I keep coming back to is this. I never wanted any of this to happen. I wanted them to listen in March when I submitted the first memo. I wanted someone to read the documentation and ask a real question. I wanted Derek to have been listened to when he raised concerns. The systems I built were never meant to be leverage. They were meant to be infrastructure. They were meant to protect the organization. And in the end, that's exactly what they did. I've had a few former colleagues reach out since everything came out. People who'd heard pieces of the story through the grapevine. Most of them just said some version of "I'm glad you're okay." Patrice sent me a bottle of bourbon that I haven't opened yet because I'm saving it for something. One younger guy from the IT team, somebody named Kyle who'd been there about 3 years, sent me a message that I've thought about more than any of the others. He said, "Mr. Briggs, I just want you to know." When they were onboarding the managed services team, I told them they should really talk to you before you left. I told them you knew things about that system that weren't in any document. They told me not to worry about it. I wrote back, "You were right to say it. That matters. It does matter. Not because it changes anything, but because somewhere in that building there's a 30-year-old who understood, without being told, that the knowledge inside a person's head is not automatically transferable to a folder or a consultant's slide deck or a vendor's migration tool. That took instinct. That's the kind of thinking that actually keeps systems running." I told him, if he ever wanted to talk infrastructure, my coffee was always on. He took me up on it. We've had lunch twice. He's sharp. He asks good questions, and he listens to the answers. Really listens, not just waiting for his turn to talk. There might be hope yet. My son called me last month, the one who's starting the graduate program in Michigan, and asked me how I was doing. I told him I was good. He said I sounded different. I asked him different how. He said, "You sound like yourself again, Dad." I didn't have anything clever to say to that. I just said, "Yeah, I think that's about right." 22 years is a long time to give to something. I gave it everything I had. I documented every decision. I built systems designed to outlast my own career. I tried to do it with integrity. In the end, the systems did their job. So did I. I've been sitting with this story for a few months now, turning it over the way you turn over something heavy. Not because it's unresolved, but because it keeps teaching me things I didn't expect to learn. Here's what I know about consequences. They don't always arrive on schedule. Sometimes they take 6 weeks. Sometimes they take 6 years. But when the work is shoddy and the decision-making is arrogant, the bill always comes. Not because the universe is keeping score in some cosmic ledger. I don't believe in that kind of accounting. I believe in something more practical. I believe that complex systems have memories. Code doesn't forget. Infrastructure doesn't forgive shortcuts. And organizations that discard the people who understand their own foundations will, sooner or later, feel exactly what those foundations were holding up. Corey walked into Meridian with a plan and a title and a level of confidence that had never been stress tested against something real. That's not unusual. I've seen it before. The danger is in ambition. Ambition is fine. Ambition builds things. The danger is the particular kind of arrogance that mistakes credentials for competence and a polished presentation for actual understanding. He didn't know what he didn't know, and he surrounded himself with people who had the same blind spot. That's when organizations get into real trouble. I think about the integrity piece a lot. Not integrity as an abstract virtue, as a daily decision. Every one of those memos I submitted in March, knowing nobody was likely to read them, was a choice. I could have stayed quiet and protected myself politically. I could have nodded along and let the consequences land without my fingerprints on the warning. Some people would call that smart. I've never been able to do it. When I see something wrong, I have to say it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, in writing. with documentation. That's just how I'm built. And the strange thing is, even when nobody listened, I slept fine. Because I'd done what I could with what I had. That's all integrity ever really is. It's not about the outcome. It's about whether you can look at your own reflection and know you told the truth when it mattered. The resilience part came later. In the summer, on the deck, reading books I put off for a decade. Ellen saying I seemed lighter. My son saying I seemed lighter. My son saying I sounded like myself again. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd been quietly suppressing to fit inside a role that had slowly stopped valuing what I actually brought to it. Getting fired, even unfairly, even painfully, gave me something back that I didn't know I'd lost. That's not a comfortable thing to admit, but it's true. And Kyle, that young guy who sent me the message saying he'd told them to talk to me before I left, and they'd told him not to worry about it. I think about him more than almost anyone else in this story. Because he had the instinct. He was 30 years old, and he already understood something that Corey, with his Duke MBA and his transformation roadmap, never figured out. That knowledge lives in people, not in documents. You can write everything down, and it still won't transfer the judgment, the context, the 10,000 small decisions that add up to expertise. That only comes from time and from caring. Kyle cared. That matters more than any credential. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from all of this, it's that. Do the work with integrity, even when nobody's watching. Build things designed to last longer than your own tenure. Stay honest, even when honesty is inconvenient. And when they show you the door, walk out with your head up and your documentation complete. The systems you built will speak for you when you're gone. Mine did.